So welcome to the Bourgault canola trials, the 2024 trials. This year we thought we would go on a virtual tour of them for you. So we'll go and we'll highlight some of the trials, but then we got the drone and we're gonna take it up in the sky and give you a bit of a bird's eye view of what we've been seeing in the plots this year. So in the plots, what we do at the Bourgault farm here, we've got a leading 9650 cart, and we have two 30-foot drills that we drag behind it there in different configurations. So it allows us to play with different fertilizer and seed configurations in a side-by-side manner. So our trials out here are 30 feet wide, just over 400 feet long, but then we replicate them 3 times in replicated blocks. So when it comes to harvest, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the middle 25 feet out of that 30-foot strip. We'll harvest it, dump it in a weigh wagon, take samples out of that, send those samples away to the elevator to get analyzed for moisture and dockage. Then we'll put all that information together, run some stats on there, and then produce a graph and some results that you can take a look at and see if something like that would work on your operation.
So now we're up in the air, taking a look down at the different treatments and side by side through the lens of the drone. And in this particular view, we can see some differences in flowering where some of the strips are going to flowering earlier than others. So the first trial that we wanted to talk about was our nitrogen rate versus placement versus source. And so what we have going on here is we have nitrogen being applied at either 90 pounds of actual N per acre or 140 pounds of actual N per acre, just knowing that there's some differences out there as far as locations and the rates that guys are starting to put down. On the placement side, we have 3 different placements. We have the nitrogen going down as a broadcast application, so spreading ahead of the drill. Then we have it going down as the sideband, in a sideband, 1.5 inch by 1 inch away. And then we have in the mid row where it is 6 inches away from the seed, and 1 mid row feeds 2 openers. So the drill that we have here is our dual knife, our Paralink dual shank PLDS equipped with banders. And that allows us to either drop the banders down and put nitrogen through them, or lock the banders up and put the nitrogen through the sideband of that PLDS opener. So we're going to get cruising along here. And some of the things that we're going to see are different strips going into flowering before the other strips. And we can kind of see some that are greener versus yellow, more yellow. So the more yellow are just going into flowering a little bit earlier on this particular time. And what we find with that is when we have lower plant stands, typically the crop goes into flowering a little bit later. And the 140 pounds of actual N going in the sideband is definitely making that crop kind of lag a little bit, just due to us kind of pruning off some of those plant stands, reducing those plant stands slightly, and then it goes into flowering a little bit later as that crop starts to branch out a little bit more. It just takes a little bit more time to get into that flowering stage. And then as we going along, we've gone through the first rep, second rep, we're coming into the third rep here, and it's just randomly placed where these different treatments are. We do see a little bit of an area there where it's a little bit more, I think, wet, and it shows up in the flowering, just taking a little longer. And that's why we do 3 reps of all of these field scale trials, just to accommodate some of these differences in the soil itself. So now we've come up to our seeding rate trial. So in this, we're keeping everything the same as far as the fertility goes. So we're using a single knife with banders on 10-inch spacing. We're putting 15 pounds of actual P205 in with the seed. The other 35 pounds is out in the mid row with 140 pounds of actual N going in the mid row as well. The only thing that's changing on this is our seeding rate. So we go from the low seeding rate at 1.2 pounds per acre, which is equivalent to about 2.5 seeds per square foot. Then we double that and we go to 2.5 pounds per acre of seed, which is about 5 seeds per square foot. And then we double that again. So we go up to the more, I would say, standard or more common rate of 5 pounds per acre, which we're shooting for about that 10 seeds per square foot. And what we're seeing out there is these strips that are a little bit more sparse. You can tell that they're a little bit further behind, not really going into flowering at the moment yet. And so those are our lowest seed rate. And what we find with those strips, and this is our third year of doing this, actually, if not more, is that the larger plants just branch out more. They just take longer to get into that flowering stage and to mature. They're usually, anywhere between 4 days up to over a week longer in maturity. So when we move into the medium seed rate, so this is at 2.5 pounds per acre, which is again more on the, I would say, lower side comparatively. We're getting into 5 seeds per square foot. We can see these strips start to go a little bit more they turn a little more yellow. They're going to flowering a little quicker. We have more plants. We have smaller plants. They start to go into the flowering quicker than those larger plants are. And when we go to the highest seeding rate, we can see that those strips there are the most yellow, the most advanced, more into the flowering stage. We have more plants. They're smaller plants. They don't branch out near as much, but that's why they get into maturity a little bit quicker. Over the years, what we've noticed though with these trials are there is no good correlation between plant stand and yield. There is a big correlation though between plant stand and maturity, where the lower the plant stand, the longer to maturity.
So we're standing out here in one trolley one to show. You can see some really big differences right now. On my right hand side over here is our low seeding rate trial. So we're down to 1.25 pound seeding rates. We're getting about 2.5 seeds per foot square. And on this side, we're up to 5 pounds. So we're up to 10 seeds per foot square. So you can really see the differences in flowering right now, where the low seeding rate, the low plant stand, down to about 2 plants, it takes a lot longer to get into maturity because it has to branch out so much, versus the higher plant stand over here, a lot less branching, and then the crop gets into flowering quicker and then comes into maturity quicker. Typically in the past, we've seen almost a week difference in maturity between these two, where the low plant stands, it takes a week longer to get to maturity. As far as yield goes though, really there's no correlation between plant stand and yield that we've found, where sometimes the lowest plant stand will actually out yield the highest plant stand in our trials. Typically in the dry years, the low plant stand will beat the higher plant stand, but in more wet years, the higher plant stand will beat the lower plant stand.
So we'll cruise along that one. We've got our 3 reps there. We'll get into the last trial on this row here. And this one is our PLDS, our Paralink dual shank opener trial. There are other dual shanks out there on the market. Ours has the ability to move the seed away from the fertilizer, and we wanted to test what that did with a sensitive crop. So this drill is our 12-inch spaced PLDS. We're 140 pounds of actual N plus 50 pounds of P2O5 are going down the sideband. The seed's on its own. So we start off at the original placement of 1.5 inches to the side and an inch deeper, the fertilizer to the seed. But we've got the ability on our openers to move that seed away from that fertilizer band a 1/2 inch at a time horizontally. So we went from 1.5, then we went to 2, and then 2.5 inches away from that fertilizer band. We also have another treatment where we brought it back to 1.5 inches, but we sunk that fertilizer another 1/2 inch down into the ground, so 1.5 inches deeper, just to get a little bit more separation. And this is our third year of doing it with canola. And what we found over the years, even moving that 1/2 inch at a time, we just noticed with the high rates of nitrogen being placed in the sideband, that our plant stands seem to increase that little bit. So anytime, if you're wanting a drill sideband operation, you're wanting to put down higher rates, you can make it a little bit lower risk. You can provide a little bit safety to those more sensitive crops like canola by just moving that nitrogen away, even a 1/2 inch at a time, and you'll see your plant stands go up. It's never an awesome idea to kill off a bunch of seed. Now you can either use that to reduce potentially your seed rate, or like we talked about with our plant stand seeding rate trial there, our seeding rate trial, we can decrease the time to maturity by having more plants. So a couple different ways to look at that one. So in this trial, we're looking at the Trimax drill, so 3-shoot option, seed row, sideband, and mid row, comparing that to a sideband operation where the seed's going down on its own and the rest of the fertility out in the sideband, and as well as a 3/4 inch knife with mid row bander configuration. So that one's on 10-inch, the other two are on 12-inch spacing. Looking back at the Trimax with nitrogen in the sideband and nitrogen in the mid-row, what we found over the years is that there's about a 20% reduction in plant stands when we bring that N in close in the sideband versus in the mid-row. Now, this is over a period of about 8 years we've had this running for. So not every year is quite that much, and some years are worse. And just as a reminder, this is at 140 pounds of actual N going down in the either sideband or mid-row, so a higher rates of nitrogen being placed. So when we do have those higher rates and we move them away from the seed and put them out in the mid-row, we find with the Trimax, having the seed on its own, some starter fertilizer in the sideband, we have our best emergence and our lowest mortality. So we also have some trials in here where we've reduced our seeding rate by 20% to see what kind of effect that has on the crop. We are also playing around with bringing some nitrogen into the sideband with that Trimax configuration, seed on its own, some starter phosphorus with just a little bit of nitrogen going in the sideband, and then the bulk of it out in the mid-row to see how that compares.
So another trial just highlighting here, it's the drill configuration trial. So we're playing around with a single knife with banders, and then the dual shank with banders, or we can lock the banders up. So on my right-hand side over here, we've got the canola seed on its own, and then we put the nitrogen and the phosphorus together in the sideband, so in the front shank of that dual shank opener. And on this side, we drop the mid-row banders down, so we move the nitrogen out of the sideband and put it in its own separate band in the mid-row. And what we've seen is in that triple shoot configuration where the nitrogen's moved away from that phosphorus, this crop went into flowering a little bit quicker. We can kind of see behind where there's a little bit more flowers on this side. And I think what's happening out here has a lot to do with just phosphorus uptake in general. When you get a lot of nitrogen surrounding around that phosphorus, the plant just can't get to it. The roots can't get through that nitrogen band to uptake that phosphorus. So when we separate them out, like on this side, we get that earlier uptake of phosphorus, get the crop up and going to get it into maturity a little bit quicker.
So in this trial, we're playing with the 10-inch space single knife with banders, and we're looking at phosphorus placed either in the seed row, a split being placed in the seed row and mid row, or all of it going down the mid row to see how that affects the crop. Another twist we've brought into this trial is looking at 3/4 inch tip versus the 2-inch tip on that single knife opener. And the theory behind that is with a wider tip, you're able to put down more phosphorus in with the seed, and you have a higher seed bed utilization, which will allow for lower mortality. So as we're going across and we're taking a look, we are seeing differences as far as flower timing. And what we've noticed over the years is that putting phosphorus out in the mid-row band, so in this case 5 inches away surrounded by a bunch of nitrogen, will actually allow for later uptake of phosphorus in the season. We don't recommend putting it all in the mid-row. You need a little bit in the seed row in order to get that pop-up effect. A lot of times what we'll see is when we have a control out there where we have no phosphorus in the system at all, and then we replace all the phosphorus in the mid-row, they start off very similar in their initial growth. But then we see later on in the season, and I'm sure we'll see it again here when we throw the drone up a little bit later as the crop is coming out of flowering, is that those treatments with phosphorus in the mid-row will actually continue to flower as that crop is accessing that phosphorus. So we'll continue to monitor this and take a look.
Another trial we wanted to highlight was our split phosphorus trial. So in this one, we've got phosphorus either going down in the seed row, a split between seed row and a mid row, or all in the mid-row. So I'm standing between two plots right now. On my right-hand side, this is all the phosphorus, 50 pounds of actual P2O5 going down the mid-row band. So we have nothing in with the seed. On this side, we have 25 actual P going in the seed row, the other 25 in the mid-row. And what we could see here is that there's definite lag where all that phosphorus went into the mid-row versus where we had some in the seed row. Now, what we found in the past with this trial over the years is that even though the phos is out in mid-row surrounded by a bunch of nitrogen, the crop will access it in the year of application, but later on. So what we're gonna see here is this crop start to kind of catch up. It'll never be quite as good as having some of that phosphorus in the mid-row, or in the seed row, I should say. And that's where we really are recommending a split, putting some in the seed row, the rest in the mid-row, and then you'll get better seed safety, but you'll be able to apply more phosphorus in your total program at seeding. So I hope you enjoyed the canola trials, but now we're going to jump over into the 2024 Bourgault wheat trials. So these are set up the same way in that they're 30 feet wide or 400 feet long, and we have them replicated 3 times in those blocks, and it's the same harvest, take the middle 25 feet weigh wagon, and that's how we're getting our results. So I thought for these trials this year, what we'll do is we'll get the drone up, take you up, and we'll kind of explain what's going on and then what we're seeing out there.
So now we're moved on to our wheat trials. We have many of the same trials set up in our wheat as we did in the canola. So this first trial here, we're using our 12-inch space dual knife drill equipped with mid-row banders. We have the ability to either lock those banders up or put them down so the nitrogen can run through those. This is our nitrogen rate versus placement versus source. So we have either 90 pounds of actual N or 140 pounds of actual N. We have that either broadcast, placed in the sideband, or placed down the mid-row. And we have 3 different sources. We have just straight urea, 4600, or we have Super U, which is a treated urea, or we have an ESN blend where we're mixing that in with some 46. And that ESN is just a polymer-coated urea, just to decrease how fast that nitrogen becomes available. So as we're going to cruise along, we're going to notice just maybe a few things. It wasn't quite like in the canola where we're looking at flowering timing, but we are looking at some different almost shades of green there. And so the first ones that we see going along is 90 versus 140 pounds of N, where the 90 pounds of actual N is a little bit lighter green than the 140 pounds. And we're kind of seeing that across the board. Doesn't really matter as far as what placement we were seeing in that one. And then we get along into the second rep here where we put all the 90 pounds of N going down, again, either as in the sideband, broadcast, or mid-row, either as Super U, ESN, or just straight urea. And then we get into the 140 pounds of N here in the second rep. And then as we finish that off, we're getting into the third rep, and that's where we have a lot more of a randomized effect here. And you can see some comparisons where it's some lighter green versus darker green strips out there. And again, a lot of that has to do with just the 90 versus 140 pounds of N. We've got quite a bit of moisture this year so far, so I think that the higher rates may pay off, and they were buffered a little bit more too with all that moisture in the spring. So we'll monitor this and see how this shakes out throughout the year. So moving along to our next trial here in the wheat, this is our Paralink dual shank trial, our PLDS. Very similar to the canola one, where we've got the ability with our dual shank to move that seed away from that nitrogen, that fertilizer shank, at 1/2-inch increments. So we wanted to see if there's any response and any safety to a more, call it tolerable crop like a wheat versus more of a sensitive crop like a canola, where we just move that nitrogen away at 1/2-inch at a time. So again, we're putting down 140 pounds of N down that sideband location on 12-inch spacing and just seeing what it does to the crop. And so far, we haven't really noticed any kind of maturity or any issues with the crop itself as we get a little tighter in there. So again, we were at 1.5 inch, 2 inch, 2.5 inch horizontally, or we drop that fertilizer knife a little deeper to get it from an inch to an inch and a half, just trying to create a little bit more separation between that nitrogen band and that seed. So that was that one. Again, not really seeing a huge amount of differences out there in general in the wheat, especially on that trial. We get into our next trial here. This one we're looking at a 3/4 inch tip versus 2 inch tip with a single shank opener and mid-row banders. So this one's on 10 inch spacing now. So we've got 3/4 inch versus 2 inch. And we also played around with either a control, no phosphorus, 35 pounds P2O5 or 70 pounds P2O5. And the thinking behind this one was when you go from a smaller tip to a larger tip, you get a little better seedbed utilization. Cereals seem to like the ability to have narrow row spacing, maybe not so concentrated, spread them out a little bit. They seem to have higher yield potential when you do that. But then when you do that as well, if you're trying to put down more phosphorus in that year with your cereals, having a little better seedbed utilization may help us kind of increase that rate going in the seed without increasing our risk. So we wanted to see what would happen in this trial, and we definitely noticed that the controls were showing up as far a little bit slower. It's a little bit slower, a little bit lighter green. Didn't have that pop-up effect. Between the 35p and 70p though, we had lots of moisture this year. I think that nullified any of the risks, but we really haven't seen any detrimental plant stand decreases yet with that crop. So we'll monitor this as the year goes on, just to see if there are any differences that are showing up at all. And obviously the harvest is the big thing. Last year when we did this trial, we did notice a bit of a yield bump on the 2 inch over the 3/4 inch. And I thought that was a pretty interesting result coming out of there.
So I thought I'd bring you down from flying around with the drone, bring you down to the ground level here just to compare, see what they look like on the ground. So on this treatment over here, this was the 0 phos. We're not putting any phosphorus on this side. And on this side over here, we've got 70 pounds of actual down a 3/4 knife in the seed row. So you can see the differences down below where there's a lot more heads out on this side, a lot less where there's no phosphorus. Otherwise, this crop actually looks pretty good, but just seeing the side-by-side comparison, obviously there's a benefit to putting the phosphorus down, but it is really neat to see that in a side-by-side comparison.
So the next trial we have, and again, not a lot of differences showing up in the cereals at this point in time this year. We do have our Trimax trial where we are playing around with the 12-inch space dual shank PLDS equipped with banders. We can lock the banders up, put them down. We can move that nitrogen from the mid row into the side band and have that comparison. We're also playing with a split where we bring a little bit of that nitrogen into the side band with that starter phosphorus. And then we do have our single knife 10-inch spaced with mid row 3/4 inch into this mix as well. And we've been running this trial for almost 7 years, 8 years now. So we kind of have a running total on this comparison between the different drill configurations out there. Again, from this angle, did we see a whole lot? Not a whole lot. Maybe we'll drop down to the ground, take a little bit closer at some of these different trials out there. But from the bird's eye view, not seeing a huge difference at this point in time. Now we're going to get along to our last trial that we're going to touch on out here. And this one is our seeding rate trial in the wheat. So 3/4 inch opener, 10-inch spacing with banders. We're looking at seeding rates from 20 seeds to 30 seeds to 40 seeds. And this one really stemmed from the different dry years and wet years just to see what would be better in those kind of conditions. In the dry year, it was theorized a little bit more that the lower seeding rate potentially will have a higher yield potential just because there's less plants for that soil to support. Over the last 3 years we've done this, we actually haven't seen a large difference in the different yields and even maturity. Definitely the lower seeding rate it takes a little bit longer, but it wasn't so much that it couldn't be overcome. So that's what we're looking at here. We're not seeing a huge difference from the air, but we'll be looking at the different seeding rates versus the yields, and then when the samples come in, if there's any disease differences there as well.
So thanks for coming along on the 2024 Bourgault trials here, this virtual tour of them. Hopefully there's something out there that maybe piqued your interest and maybe you want to try on your own operation. If you want to find the results, we can look back at previous years, go on to Bourgault.com under the Agronomy tab, field trial results, and you'll see PDFs of all the trials we've done in the past. We'll get this year's trials results up this winter for you to go and check out. So if there is any other questions though you had, feel free to reach out to myself or to the other agronomists there at Bourgault Industries at the Bourgault Agronomy team, and we'd be happy to talk about these trials or anything else agronomy related. So again, thanks for tuning in.